Seattle, February 18th, 1943. 12 minutes past noon. A column of black smoke rises above the industrial district, thick and oily, climbing higher than the tallest smokestacks along the waterfront. Below it, the walls of the Fry packing plant are gone. Steel girders twist upward like the ribs of a burning animal. Fire moves through the debris in slow waves, feeding on beef fat and jet fuel, and the wooden crates of a meatpacking house that had been running its afternoon shift 5 minutes earlier. Inside that fire lies the most expensive weapon in American history, or what remains of it. The men who arrive first cannot understand what they are looking at. A firefighter tries to reach the wreckage and never comes back. 20 workers are already dead inside the plant. 11 more bodies lie somewhere in the ruins of a machine so secret that most of the men now shoveling through the ashes do not know its name. They only know that something enormous fell from the sky, and that, whatever it was, the government wants every scrap of it collected before nightfall. The machine had a name. It was called the B-29. And on that afternoon in Seattle, the program that would end the Second World War was, by every reasonable measure, finished. 29 months later, the direct descendant of the machine, burning in the ashes of the Fry packing plant, would open its bomb bay over a Japanese city at 8:15 in the morning, and the world would enter a new age. 3 years earlier, in the spring of 1940, the United States Army Air Corps had gathered its senior planners in a room in Washington and asked them a question that no air force in the world had yet answered. The war in Europe had begun, France was falling, and America, still officially neutral, was already looking east, across the Pacific, toward an empire that stretched from the coast of China to the atolls of Micronesia. The question was simple. If war came with Japan, how would America strike the Japanese home islands? The answer was that it could not with any aircraft that existed, not with any aircraft that had ever existed. The B-17 Flying Fortress, the pride of the Army Air Corps, could carry a useful bomb load, perhaps 1,000 miles. Japan lay 4,000 miles from Pearl Harbor. There were no American bases within reach. There was no way in. The generals wrote a specification. They asked for a bomber that could fly 3,000 miles with 4 tons of bombs, cruise above 30,000 feet, and defend itself against modern fighters. Every engineer in the country who read the specification said the same thing. It could not be built. Boeing said it could. The company that had designed the B-17 submitted a design called Model 345. It was pressurized. It was longer than a tennis court. Its wings were so thin and so long that engineers questioned whether they would hold their own weight. It carried 4 Wright R-3350 engines, each with 18 cylinders arranged in 2 rows, each producing more than 2,000 horsepower. No aircraft engine that complex had ever been mass-produced. The prototype existed only on paper. The Army Air Corps signed the contract anyway. 1941. 14 prototypes ordered before a single one had flown. By the end of that year, after Pearl Harbor, the order had grown to 1,500 aircraft, then 2,000, then more. General Henry Arnold, the chief of the Army Air Forces, staked his career on the machine. If the superfortress failed, the war in the Pacific would be fought without strategic bomber. And Arnold knew it. The chief test pilot was a man named Edmund Allen, 47 years old, quiet, methodical, the most respected experimental pilot in America. He had flown the first Boeing 247, the first Stratoliner, the first B-17. When Boeing needed a machine to fly, they gave it to Eddie Allen. He did not fly for glory. He flew because someone had to find out what the airplane would do before the young men in uniform tried to fly it into combat. On September 21st, 1942, Allen climbed into the cockpit of B-29, serial number 41002, the first prototype, and lifted it off the runway at Boeing Field in Seattle. The airplane flew. Allen would later tell engineers it was the finest flying machine he had ever handled. It was also quietly killing itself. The R3350 engines ran hot. They ran hotter than the cooling system could manage. In flight, the exhaust valves burned. Oil leaked past worn seals. Magnesium components in the crankcase, chosen to save weight, would ignite once the engine caught fire, and magnesium fires cannot be extinguished. Water will not stop them. Foam will not stop them. They burn through aluminum spars in 90 seconds. Boeing knew. The Army knew. Every engineer on the program knew. And yet the second prototype, B-29 serial 41003, was pushed into flight testing anyway, because the war would not wait. On February 18, 1943, Eddie Allen took the second prototype up for its 9th test flight. 11 men were aboard. Allen at the controls, 10 engineers and crew. The airplane climbed to 5,000 feet over Puget Sound. 22 minutes into the flight, the number 1 engine caught fire. Allen turned back for the field. The transcripts of what happened next survived. They were reconstructed from radio recordings and from the notes of the tower controllers. Allen kept his voice level. He asked for landing clearance. He held his altitude. The fire spread from the engine into the wing. The crew tried to reach the flames with hand extinguishers. It was already too late. At 12:26 in the afternoon, 3 miles from the runway, the left wing began to fail. 4 men jumped from the rear compartment and died before their parachutes could open. The airplane rolled left, then dropped through the roof of the Fry packing plant on Airport Way South. 11 men aboard, 20 workers on the ground, 1 firefighter who ran into the burning debris and did not come out. 32 dead in a single afternoon, and the second of only 3 prototypes reduced to slag. In Washington, General Arnold read the report and did not speak for a long time. Boeing had lost its finest pilot. The program had lost a prototype it could not spare, and in Congress, questions were being asked about a machine that had already cost more money than any weapon in the history of the Republic. The number, when it was finally tallied, would come to $3 billion. $3 billion in 1940s money. To place that figure in context, the Manhattan Project, the entire secret effort to build the atomic bomb, cost $1.9 billion. The superfortress cost more than the bomb it would eventually deliver. It cost more than the 8 tanks of Sherman divisions. It cost more than the aircraft carriers of the Pacific Fleet. It was the single most expensive weapons program of the entire Second World War. And in early 1943, it did not work. The winter that followed almost killed the program a second time. Wright could not build enough engines. The engines it did build failed. New airframes rolled off the Boeing lines at Wichita, Kansas, and Renton, Washington, and sat on the tarmac with no propellers, no gun turrets, no radios. Snow covered them. Wichita reported blizzards through January and February. Mechanics worked outside in wind that dropped the temperature to 20 degrees below zero. They wore fingerless gloves so they could handle the tools. Their skin froze to the metal. The Air Force called it the Battle of Kansas. In March of 1944, General Arnold flew to Wichita himself and walked the flight line. What he found were hundreds of B-29s that were not airplanes. They were parts. 16,000 modifications had to be made to each aircraft before it could fly. There were not enough parts. There were not enough men. Arnold gave an order that spread through the plants within hours. The B-29s would fly out of Kansas by April 1st, or heads would roll. Not metaphorically, literally. Colonels and generals would be relieved. Careers would end. The industrial power of the United States would be applied to the problem without limit. They did it. They shipped 150 aircraft to India by mid-April. The men who had frozen in Wichita would tell their grandchildren about it 40 years later, and their grandchildren would not believe them. Across the Pacific, in Tokyo, Japanese military intelligence had been tracking American bomber development since 1942. They had photographs. They had captured documents. They had estimates. They knew a new heavy bomber was under construction. They had even given it a name in their reports: B-29, B-29. What they did not know was what it could do. Japanese analysts working from the specifications of American bombers already in the field estimated the range of the new aircraft at something manageable, something that could threaten outposts, something that could not reach the home islands from any base the Allies then possessed. They were wrong by half, and by the time they understood how wrong they had been, the first squadrons of superfortresses were already unloading in India, and the men who would fly them were memorizing the map of southwestern Japan. The machine that had crashed into a meatpacking plant in Seattle. The machine that had frozen on a runway in Kansas. The machine that had cost more than the atomic bomb. That machine was coming. Chengdu, China. June 15th, 1944, 2 hours before midnight. 68 B-29s sit on the runway with their propellers turning. The engines idle at a low growl that carries for miles across the flat monsoon country of Bengal. The men in the cockpits have been briefed. They have been given photographs of a place they will never see in daylight. A city on the northern coast of Kyushu. Yawata. The steel works. The furnaces that had built every Japanese battleship, every tank, every rifle, carried by every soldier of the Imperial Army. For the first time since Jimmy Doolittle's raid on Tokyo 2 years and 2 months earlier, the American war would touch Japan directly. Doolittle had flown 16 B-25s from the deck of the Hornet. His aircraft had bombed once and crash-landed in China. It was a symbol. It was a message. It was not a strategic campaign. 68 B-29s, each carrying 2 tons of bombs from bases inside China, would be a campaign. Or so General Henry Arnold hoped. The plan was called Operation Matterhorn. It had begun as an idea in Washington and was now, in the summer of 1944, being tested by real men flying real airplanes over 5,000 miles of jungle and mountain and enemy sky. The problem was fuel. The bases from which the superfortresses flew were in Chengdu, deep in western China, beyond the reach of Japanese armies, but also beyond the reach of every road and every railway in Asia. Every gallon of aviation gasoline, every bomb, every spare part, every meal eaten by every airman had to be flown over the Himalayas from India. The route was called the Hump. Its charts were marked with the wreckage of American transport aircraft that had been lost in the mountains and would never be found. The mathematics of the Hump would eventually break the spine of Matterhorn. For every gallon of gasoline delivered to Chengdu, the C-47 transports that carried it had already burned nearly 7 of their own. The superfortresses were consuming more fuel than they were dropping bombs. But that reckoning was still months away. On the night of June 15th, all that mattered was that the first strike was flying. 47 of the 68 bombers reached the target. 5 aircraft were lost. The damage to the Yawata steelworks was slight. In the mess halls at Chengdu, the crews drank coffee at 4 in the morning and asked one another what they had actually accomplished. No one had a good answer. But they had done it. They had bombed Japan, and they would go back. They went back on August 20th. This time, in daylight, Sergeant Shigeo Nobi flew a Kawasaki Ki-45 Toryu, a twin-engined heavy fighter, out of an airfield on Kyushu. His unit was the 4th Sentai. His mission that afternoon was to intercept the American bombers returning to Yawata for the 4th time. The Ki-45 was not a match for the B-29 at high altitude. It was slower, it carried lighter guns, its engines choked in the thin air. Every Japanese fighter pilot who had tried to shoot down a superfortress with cannon fire had come away frustrated. The bombers flew too high, they flew too fast. They flew in formations whose defensive gun stations covered every angle of approach. Nobi knew this. He also knew what came next. Over the target that afternoon, he pushed his throttles to the stops, dove out of the sun, and drove his Ki-45 directly into the wing of a B-29 of the 468th Bombardment Group. The bomber was called Gertrude C. It fell out of the formation trailing fire. Nobi's fighter broke apart at the moment of impact. The tumbling wreckage of the Ki-45 then struck a second B-29 called Calamity Sioux, which also went down. 2 American bombers destroyed, 22 American airmen killed, 1 Japanese pilot killed, and a new fact of the air war over Japan established: ramming worked. It was not called kamikaze. That word had not yet entered the language of the imperial military. The organized suicide attacks against American ships would not begin until October, 3 months later, in the waters off Leyte. What Nobi had done at Yawata was earlier. It was quieter. It was the first sign that a Japanese pilot who could not shoot down a B-29 could still stop it by throwing his own aircraft at it. In Tokyo, the Imperial Army Air Service was watching. They were also quietly building. In November of 1944, at an airfield called Narimasu, just west of Tokyo, a special unit was formed. It was drawn from the 47th Sentai. Its aircraft, mostly Nakajima Ki-44 Shoki fighters, were stripped of their guns. Every unnecessary weight was removed. Radios, armor plate, ammunition, cannon shells. What remained was an airframe, an engine, a pilot, and a full tank of fuel. The unit was called Shinten Seikutai. Its purpose was simple. Its pilots would fly their unarmed fighters into American B-29s. While Shinten Seikutai trained at Narimasu, the 244th Sentai took up positions to defend Tokyo itself. Its commander was Major Teruhiko Kobayashi. He was 24 years old. He was one of the youngest Sentai commanders in the entire Imperial Army Air Service. His pilots flew the Kawasaki Ki-61 Heian, a liquid-cooled fighter designed to reach the altitude at which the B-29s cruised. Kobayashi was a man. His pilots would follow. He led every mission from the front. He would eventually ram a B-29 himself and survive by parachute. His face appeared in Japanese newsreels. School children in Tokyo memorized his name. He was, in the winter of 1944, one of the most famous Japanese fighter pilots alive. Against these defenders, the 20th Air Force now shifted its weight. Operation Matterhorn, hobbled by the impossible logistics of the hump, was quietly being wound down. The new bases were in the Mariana Islands, 1,200 miles south of Tokyo, captured from the Japanese in the summer of 1944 at a cost of tens of thousands of American lives. From Saipan, from Tinian, from Guam, the B-29s could fly to Japan without crossing any mountains. Their fuel could come by ship. The war would now be waged from concrete runways bulldozed out of coral. The man given command of the Marianas Force was Brigadier General Haywood Hansell. He was 41 years old, thoughtful, a theorist. Before the war, at the Air Corps Tactical School in Alabama, he had been one of the young officers who had helped build the American doctrine of daylight precision bombing, high altitude, tight formations, Norden bomb sites, the industrial destruction of enemy factories by aimed bombs dropped from 30,000 feet. The doctrine was elegant, it was rational. It was also, over Japan, about to fail. On the morning of November 24, 1944, Hansell dispatched 111 B-29s from Saipan against the Nakajima aircraft engine factory at Musashino in the western suburbs of Tokyo. The mission was called San Antonio 1. It was the first strike against the Japanese capital from the Marianas. The bombers climbed to 30,000 feet. They found the target. They opened their bomb bay doors, and they encountered something no American aircrew had ever seen: the jet stream. At the altitude at which the B-29s flew over Japan, the wind blew at speeds that would not be measured with any precision until after the war. 200 miles per hour. Sometimes faster. It ran west to east, following the curvature of the atmosphere. When the bombers flew into it, they crawled across the sky at ground speeds, barely fast enough to maintain control. When they flew with it, they raced across the targets so quickly that the Norden bomb sites, calibrated for a world without such winds, could not solve the problem. Bombs released at that altitude drifted for miles before hitting the ground. Approximately 125 Japanese fighters climbed to meet the raid. They executed 184 separate attacks against the American formations. Some fired guns. Some tried to ram. One B-29 was destroyed by a ramming attack in the vicinity of the target. Others were damaged. The bombers dropped their loads. They turned back for Saipan. When the photo reconnaissance results came back to Hansell's headquarters, they showed almost nothing. The United States Strategic Bombing Survey would later determine that of the bombs released against Musashino during that period, fewer than 5% had landed inside the factory boundaries. Hansell tried again and again. Musashino was struck 7 times between November and January. Each mission followed the same pattern: high altitude, precision doctrine, jet stream, miss. The Nakajima plant, which was one of the primary sources of engines for the Japanese Army Air Service, continued to produce. Meanwhile, the Japanese defense was learning. The 47th Sentai and the 244th Sentai were rewriting their intercept tactics with every raid. On January 27, 1945, as the B-29s returned to Tokyo, Japanese fighters shot down or fatally damaged 9 of them in a single day. Master Sergeant Isamu Sakamoto rammed a B-29 that morning and survived by parachute. It was the highest single-day loss the American force had yet suffered in the Pacific. In Washington, Arnold was reading these reports and losing patience. He had staked his career on the superfortress. The superfortress was not delivering. The daylight precision doctrine that had failed to break Germany in 1943 and had succeeded only after being modified with area attacks and long-range fighter escort was now failing again over Japan. Arnold did not have another 2 years. He did not have another 6 months. Congress was asking questions. The Navy was asking questions. And the superfortress crews on Saipan were dying in accidents and in combat at rates that could not be sustained. On January 20th, 1945, Arnold ordered Hansell relieved. His replacement was already flying west. Curtis Emerson LeMay was 38 years old. In photographs from that winter, he looks older. His face is heavy. He seldom smiles. He speaks in short sentences, delivered in a monotone that men who served under him would remember for the rest of their lives. He does not explain his decisions. He does not consult. He does not permit disagreement once an order has been given. He had commanded the 3rd Air Division in England in 1943 and 1944. He had led the first shuttle mission over Regensburg. He had flown in the lead aircraft on missions his crews thought were suicidal. When the doctrine did not work, he had changed it. When the formations were failing, he had rewritten them in a week. He was 38 years old, and he had already sent more men to their deaths than most generals do in a lifetime. He arrived at Guam in late January and read the action reports of the Marianas campaign. What he read told him 3 things. The high-altitude precision doctrine did not work over Japan. The jet stream made it impossible. Japanese fighter defense was not the main problem. Post-war analysis would confirm what LeMay already suspected. Approximately 76% of B-29 battle damage came from anti-aircraft artillery. Approximately 13% came from fighters. The Type 88 and Type 99 guns of the Imperial Army, firing shells fused for the altitude at which the bombers cruised, were doing most of the killing. And the Japanese cities themselves were built of wood. That last fact had been in every intelligence briefing since 1942. American planners had studied the construction of Tokyo and Osaka and Nagoya. They had built full-scale mock-ups of Japanese urban neighborhoods at Dugway Proving Ground in Utah. They had tested incendiary weapons against them. The bomb that had worked best was called the M69. It was a small hexagonal cylinder filled with jellied gasoline. It weighed 6 pounds. It was designed to be dropped in clusters. It burned at temperatures that ignited paper, wood, and cloth on contact. LeMay had the weapon. He had the aircraft. He had, above all, a headquarters in Washington that was running out of patience. Through the first weeks of February, he studied the problem. He talked to no one. He read reports late into the night in a small office on Guam. And when he had made up his mind, he issued the order that would change the character of the air war in the Pacific. The B-29s would fly at night. They would fly low, 5,000 to 9,000 feet. Low enough that the jet stream did not matter. Low enough that anti-aircraft guns designed for 30,000 feet would fire above them. They would fly individually rather than in formation, saving fuel, allowing each aircraft to reach its release point without the burden of holding formation. They would carry no ammunition for their upper turrets. The gunners would stay aboard, but the guns would be empty, the weight of the shells replaced by additional bombs. Only the tail gunner would keep his ammunition in case a Japanese night fighter came in from behind, and they would carry no high-explosive bombs. Their entire payload would be incendiaries. The crews were told on March 8th. Some wept, some refused to fly and were replaced. Most obeyed. The mission commander, Brigadier General Thomas Power, briefed the men in the Quonset of Guam and Saipan and Tinian. While the sun set on the 9th of March, 325 B-29s took off that night. They came in over Tokyo just after midnight on the 10th of March, 1945. They came in at 5,000 feet. The Pathfinders arrived first, dropping their incendiaries in an X-shaped pattern that marked the aiming point for the main force. The winds over the target that night were unusual. They were steady and dry, gusting to 25 knots. The fires that started under the Pathfinders spread within minutes. Within an hour, they had merged. Within 2 hours, They were creating their own weather. Superheated air rose above the burning districts of Asakusa and Shitamachi at speeds that lifted debris a mile into the sky. Cold air rushed in at street level to replace it. The winds accelerated. The fires accelerated. Water in the canals boiled. 279 bombers found the target and dropped their loads. They released approximately 1,700 tons of incendiary bombs into an area of Tokyo where the population density exceeded 100,000 people per square mile. 16 square miles of the city burned. Approximately 100,000 people died that night. More than 1 million were left homeless. The number of dead exceeded the immediate death toll of any single air raid in the history of warfare. It exceeded, by some measures, the immediate death toll of either atomic bomb that would follow 5 months later. The Japanese defense could not stop it. Their radar had been designed to detect bombers at high altitude. The B-29s slipped in beneath the coverage. Their night fighter force was small. Only a handful of Ki-45, Torius and Nakajima J-1N Geckos rose that night, and most could not find the low-flying bombers in the smoke and the glow of the burning city. The famed Shinton Seikutai never launched a ramming attack. There was nothing to ram at that altitude they could catch. 14 B-29s were lost, fewer than 5% of the force, the lowest casualty rate of any major raid on Japan to that point. In his command post on Guam, LeMay waited for the first reports. When they came, he did not celebrate. He did not sleep either. He sat with a cigar and read the reconnaissance photographs as they came in over the following day, and he understood 2 things at once. The war in the Pacific had just been shortened by months, perhaps by years, and the character of that war had been changed in a way that could not be undone. He would fly the same mission against Nagoya on March 11th, against Osaka on March 13th, against Kobe on March 16th, against Nagoya again on March 18th. 5 raids in 10 nights. The industrial districts of every major Japanese city would burn. But those raids would be finishing what Tokyo had begun. What Tokyo had proven was that the superfortress, the machine that had failed at Seattle and frozen at Wichita, the machine that had been useless over Musashino, was in fact the most destructive weapon of conventional war ever placed in the hands of any air force in history. And on a small island in the Western Pacific called Tinian, a group of men that no one on Guam had heard of, flying a special version of the B-29 that even LeMay was not fully briefed on, were beginning their final training. They would fly to Japan in August. They would carry 1 bomb. Wendover Field, Utah. December 17th, 1944. 2.5 months before LeMay's fires would burn Tokyo, another chapter of the same story had already begun. In a place chosen because there was nothing near it, the base sits on a salt flat on the Nevada border. The wind blows through the barracks day and night. There is 1 road in. There are guards on the road. There is no town within 100 miles that a man could visit on a weekend pass without being followed. The unit that arrives at Wendover that winter has a designation but no history. It is called the 509th Composite Group. Its commander is a colonel named Paul Warfield Tibbets, Jr. He is 29 years old. He will turn 30 in 2 months. He has flown B-17s over Europe. He has flown the first American mission over occupied France in 1942. He has personally test-flown the B-29 through some of its worst engine failures at Wichita and lived to write the reports. Now, he has been given the strangest order of his career. He has been told to train a bomber group for a mission that has not been fully explained to him. He has been told to select the finest, B-29 crews in the Army Air Forces and bring them to a base where they will not be permitted to leave, will not be permitted to write home about their work, and will spend the next 7 months practicing a single maneuver. Drop one bomb. Turn sharply. Fly away as fast as the aircraft will fly. The bomb they will drop does not yet exist. When it does exist, only a handful of men in the world will understand what it is. But Tibbets has been told enough to know that when the moment comes, the B-29 that carries, it will not survive if it is still above the target. His crews must be able to release, bank 155 degrees, and put 10 miles between themselves and the blast in the seconds available. They practice for months. They also fly a different aircraft than the ordinary Superfortress. The Silverplate program, run in parallel with the main B-29 production lines, produces 65 modified aircraft for atomic delivery. They have new propellers. They have reversible pitch. They have fuel-injected engines. Above all, they are lighter. The armor plate is stripped out. The gun turrets are removed. Only the tail guns remain. The bomb bay is redesigned to carry a single weapon that weighs almost 10,000 pounds and is shaped like nothing any bomber has carried before. The men of the 509th do not know what they will carry. Some of them guess. Most do not want to guess. In May and June of 1945, the group moves to Northfield on the island of Tinian, in the Marianas, 1,200 miles south of Tokyo. They arrive on an island already crowded with B-29 units flying nightly against Japanese cities. LeMay's fires are burning through Nagoya and Osaka and Yokohama that spring. The 509th does not fly those missions. They fly their own training runs. They drop practice bombs the size and shape of what they will eventually carry, filled with high explosive, on Japanese-held islands in the northern Marianas that have been bypassed by the American advance. The other B-29 crews on Tinian resent them. Songs are written, cartoons are drawn on Quonset hut walls. The 509th, the men who do not fly, the men who do not fight, the men who eat the same food and take up the same runway and never seem to earn their keep. Tibbets says nothing. His men say nothing. They wait. On the morning of July 26th, a heavy cruiser called the Indianapolis arrived at Tinian carrying a wooden crate and a small canister of enriched uranium. 4 days later, on her return voyage, she would be torpedoed by a Japanese submarine and sink with the loss of nearly 900 men, one of the worst naval disasters in American history. But her cargo was on Tinian. The bomb was assembled in a small building at Northfield over the following days. It was called Little Boy. It was 10.5 feet long. It weighed 9,700 pounds. It used a gun-type detonator that fired one subcritical mass of enriched uranium into another, achieving a critical mass at the moment of detonation. The design was so simple, and its principles so well understood that it had never been tested. The scientists were certain it would work. On the night of August 5th, Tibbets sat down in the mess hall with sergeant of the paint shop and asked for a favor. He wanted a name painted on the nose of his aircraft. His aircraft was B-29, serial 44-86292. The name was his mother's name, Enola Gay Tibbets, a woman who lived in Miami, Florida, and did not know why her son had needed the Army Air Forces for the last 3 years. He would not tell her what he had done for many months afterward. The paint dried overnight. At 2:45 in the morning on August 6, 1945, Colonel Tibbets released the brakes on the Enola Gay and rolled down the runway at Northfield. 12 men were aboard. His co-pilot, Captain Robert Lewis, his navigator, Captain Theodore Van Kirk, his bombardier Major Thomas Feareby, his weaponeer Captain William Parsons of the United States Navy, who was there because the bomb was a Navy design and because he was the man responsible for keeping it from detonating during takeoff. Parsons had a problem that had kept him awake for most of the previous week. Little Boy was armed on the ground. If the Enola Gay crashed on takeoff, and B-29s had been crashing on takeoff from Tinian for months due to their weight and the length of the runway, the bomb might detonate. It might not. The scientists were divided. Parsons had watched 4 B-29s crash and burn on Tinian since his arrival. He had decided he would not gamble. Once the aircraft was airborne, Parsons climbed down into the bomb bay. He worked in a cramped space in the thin air of high altitude. He inserted the cordite propellant charges into the breech of the gun assembly by hand. He did the work with a manual and a flashlight and the practiced motions of a man who had rehearsed the procedure hundreds of times on the ground. When he was finished, Little Boy was fully armed. If the aircraft went down now, it would be with a live atomic weapon aboard. But it would not detonate on impact. That was the trade Parsons had made. The Enola Gay climbed to 31,000 feet. 2 other B-29s flew with her. One carried scientific instruments, one carried cameras. Ahead of them, 3 weather reconnaissance aircraft had already scouted the primary and secondary targets. Hiroshima, Kokura, Nagasaki. The lead weather aircraft over Hiroshima reported clear skies. Tibbets received the message at 7:07 in the morning. The primary target was confirmed. Hiroshima, on the morning of August 6th, held approximately 350,000 people. It was the headquarters of the Japanese Second General Army, responsible for the defense of southern Japan against the American invasion. Everyone in the city knew was coming. It had scarcely been bombed. LeMay had spared it. So had the other commanders. The city was being held, as several were being held, for reasons the people who lived there did not know. At 8:15 in the morning, Hiroshima time, radar operators, outside the city, noted a small group of aircraft high overhead. They had noted the weather aircraft earlier and had sounded an all clear. When the second group appeared, the operators concluded it was another reconnaissance flight. No general alarm was raised. Below the Enola Gay, the people of Hiroshima were beginning their day. Major Feareby had been sighting through his Norden bomb sight for the last 2 minutes. He identified the aiming point Tibbets had briefed. The WWII Bridge, a T-shaped structure in the center of the city that was clearly visible from 31,000 feet. At 8:15 and 17 seconds, he released. The Enola Gay lifted 600 feet as the weight fell away. Tibbets rolled her 155 degrees to the right and dove. The maneuver had been practiced for 7 months. Little Boy fell for 43 seconds. It detonated at 1,900 feet above the courtyard of the Shima Surgical Clinic, a few hundred feet from the WWII Bridge. The yield was estimated at 15 kilotons. Aboard the Enola Gay, the tail gunner, Staff Sergeant George Caron, saw it first. The light came before the shockwave. He said afterward that it looked like a photographer's flashbulb going off in the belly of the aircraft. Then the shockwave hit, 2 of them, in succession, the direct blast and the ground reflection. Both aircraft shook. Both aircraft held together. Both aircraft turned for Tinian. Behind them, a city of 350,000 people had ceased to exist as a city. The estimates of the dead have varied for 80 years. The most careful studies conclude that approximately 70,000 people died in the first day. Approximately 70,000 more died in the 4 months that followed, from burns, from radiation sickness, from injuries that could not be treated because the hospitals of Hiroshima had also been destroyed. Total deaths in the first 4 months, somewhere between 70,000 and 140,000. Emperor Hirohito was informed within hours. His senior military advisors were divided. Some argued that the United States could not possibly have more than one such weapon. Others were not certain. 3 days later, they would receive their answer. On the morning of August 9th, a second B-29 took off from Tinian. Its name was Boxcar. Its commander was Major Charles Sweeney. He was 25 years old. Boxcar carried a bomb called Fat Man. It was a plutonium implosion weapon. It was heavier than Little Boy. It was more sophisticated. Its design had been tested 3 weeks earlier in the desert of New Mexico at a place called Trinity. Little Boy had never needed a test. Fat Man had. The primary target that morning was Kokura, a city on the northern coast of Kyushu that housed a major arsenal. The secondary target was Nagasaki. The mission went wrong almost from the beginning. Before takeoff, Sweeney's ground crew discovered a fuel transfer pump malfunction. 600 gallons of fuel in the reserve tank in the rear bomb bay could not be transferred to the main tanks in flight. That was 600 gallons of dead weight. It would remain with the aircraft to the end of the mission. Sweeney was told he could abort. He chose to fly. He did not think that another aircraft could be readied in time. He believed the Japanese leadership needed to receive the second blow within days of the first if they were to be persuaded that the United States possessed a stockpile. He also had a rendezvous problem. Boxcar was to meet its 2 support aircraft over the small island of Yakushima before proceeding to Japan. One of the support aircraft, the observation ship carrying scientific instruments, arrived. The other, the photographic aircraft, did not. Sweeney circled for 40 minutes waiting for it. He burned fuel he did not have. He finally proceeded to Kokura with only one escort. Over Kokura, the crew found smoke. The city next to Kokura, Yawata, had been bombed with conventional weapons the night before. The wind was carrying the smoke of Yawata across the Kokura arsenal. Sweeney could not see the aiming point. He made 3 passes. He never got a visual bombardier's solution. Anti-aircraft fire began to reach his altitude. Japanese fighters were reported climbing. He turned for Nagasaki. Over Nagasaki, the clouds parted for only a few seconds. His bombardier, Captain Kermit Behan, sighted through a break in the overcast and released. Fat Man detonated at 11:02 in the morning, local time, 1,650 feet above the Urakami Valley in the northern part of the city. The bomb missed its intended aiming point by more than a mile. It landed in a valley bordered by ridges that contained the blast to one side of the city. Nagasaki suffered less total destruction than Hiroshima, despite the more powerful weapon. Approximately 40,000 people died within the first day, perhaps 80,000 within 4 months. Boxcar was now well below her required fuel reserve. Sweeney did not have the range to return to Tinian. He did not have the range to reach Iwo Jima. He barely had the range, if he flew with care, to reach the emergency field on Okinawa that had been captured that spring at terrible cost. He shut down engines to conserve fuel. He glided when he could. When he sighted the Okinawa runway, he fired every emergency flare on the aircraft because his radio was not receiving replies. He landed at high speed, blew both wingtip tanks dry, and came to a stop at the far end of the runway with the number 2 engine dead from fuel starvation. He had, by the reckoning of his flight engineer, about 7 minutes of fuel remaining. On the following day, August 10th, the Japanese government sent its first surrender feeler through neutral channels in Switzerland. It contained one condition, that the emperor be permitted to remain on the throne. The war did not end that day. It would take 5 more days of negotiation and the intervention of the emperor himself before the message was made public. At noon and on August 15, 945, Emperor Hirohito's recorded voice was broadcast on Japanese radio for the first time in the history of the empire. The language was formal. It was archaic. It was so removed from the speech of ordinary Japanese that many listeners could not understand what he had said. He said that the war situation had developed not necessarily to Japan's advantage. He said that the enemy had begun to employ a new and most cruel bomb. He said that the government of Japan had accepted the terms of the Potsdam Declaration. The Second World War was over. The superpower fortress had done what it was built to do. 3,970 B-29s were produced between 1943 and 1946. They flew the closing months of the war in Europe as well, but their true campaign was against Japan. They dropped 147,000 tons of bombs on the Japanese home islands. They destroyed 67 cities. They killed, by the estimates of the United States Strategic Bombing Survey, somewhere between 330,000 and 500,000 Japanese civilians before the atomic bombs were used. Curtis LeMay would later remark that if the United States had lost the war, he would have been tried as a war criminal. He said it plainly. He did not apologize for it. Paul Tibbets flew the Enola Gay home in November of 1945. He was 30 years old. He would live to be 92. He never apologized for what he had done at Hiroshima. He asked that his ashes be scattered over the English Channel when he died, so that no grave would exist to be desecrated. Charles Sweeney lived to be 79. He wrote a book about the Nagasaki mission. He kept flying boxcar in his memory to the end of his life. The Enola Gay is preserved today at the Smithsonian National Air and Space Museum's Udvar-Hazy Center in Virginia. She sits in the light of the great glass hall. Visitors walk past her every day. Some of them stop and read the placard. Most of them do not. She looks small. She looks ordinary. She looks like an old airplane. She is not. She is the machine that fell out of the sky over a meat-packing plant in Seattle in 1943. And that flew again, and that crossed a Pacific Ocean where Sergeant Nobi rammed his fighter into her sister ships over Yawata, where Master Sergeant Sakamoto broke a wing over Tokyo, where LeMay burned the industrial cities of an empire in a single spring, and where one crew, on one morning, over one city, ended the largest war in human history in 43 seconds. She is what it looks like when a nation decides that a war will not go on any longer. She is the B-29.